we've allowed the cancer of relativism to infect us, so we think there are no shared universal values, and there is no freedom without those shared universals.
Vrijheid is iets wat je niet kan waarderen wanneer je het helemaal hebt. Je moet het een tijdje niet hebben en dan pas begrijp je wat je mist.
Reverse the question. Can art destroy the world? And I think it can. You can choose either to be abused or not.
The political news is robust. The safety of journalists.
We hacked into the audience and then all of a sudden 300 phones would ring, you know.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to DeBalie. I am Kirsten van den Hul, and I will be your moderator tonight for Freedom Lecture number 16. This is our 4th season of Freedom Lectures. I'm very curious to see if we have any regular visitors among us. Is there anybody who's been to another Freedom Lecture before? Yes. A few only, so we have a lot of newcomers. So let me tell you a little bit about the Freedom Lecture series we've been doing here at DeBalie. I already said the 16th time. So some of our previous Freedom Lecturers that we've welcomed here were Nawal Asadawi from Egypt. Speaking about feminism, and we've had, for example, Frank Mugisha from Uganda, LGBTI activist. But we've also had journalists from Russia. We've had, actually we had last fall, we had the daughter of Boris Nemtsov, the murdered Russian opposition activist and politician. So it's always a person who is fighting, sometimes at great cost and risk, for freedom. And tonight, we are actually for the first time making, we were talking about that over dinner, for the first time we're making the connection between the environment and human rights. And I'm just very curious to hear if that is a connection that is new to or surprising maybe to some of you in the audience. Is there somebody who's new to this connection? Or is everybody here an expert maybe? Feels that way. It does. So just out of curiosity, what brings you here? What do you do in daily life?
I'm a consultant and I'm facilitating cultural transformations in organizations.
And why here tonight?
Because it's all about values and purpose, and we see more and more that companies are concentrating on their purpose and their values, which are related to a better planet.
Thank you for joining us. Just just out of curiosity, what brings you here? Are you professionally interested or personally?
No, I think it's rather personally rather than professionally. Yeah.
It's a topic that you've done research on before?
No, it's more I'm interested in specifically animal rights and animal activism, and this is of course closely related to it. So.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining us. Do we have any legal experts in the house as well? Any lawyers? Yeah, I saw hands. Yeah, legal experts. Lots of them actually. Welcome. Do we have students as well? Students? Yay, great, wonderful. NGOs, obviously, I'm expecting. Yeah, that's some. Policymakers as well? Artists, yay! Give it up for the artist. Right. Journalist, I already heard some journalists. Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us. And also, thank you for joining those who are with us through live stream tonight. What are we going to be doing tonight? Well, first of all, let me mention that this is a program that would not have been possible without the partnership with Stop Ecocide .nl. So let's hear it for stopecocide.nl. Yes. Wonderful. And of course, I should also mention the financial support of V-Fonds and Democratie en Media, who are facilitating the Vrijheidslezing with their generous support. So give it up for them as well. Thank you for supporting us. Now, what we will be doing tonight is, of course, we will be listening to our very, very special guest, Polly Higgins, whom will be introduced in further detail by our first speaker. Thank you very much for joining us, Polly. I'm very much looking forward to your contribution. So we always invite somebody to introduce the Freedom Lecturer, somebody who is professionally involved. Sometimes they even have a personal relationship that goes way back. And that's what we are going to be kicking off tonight's evening with. Then we will be listening to Freedom Lecturer Polly Higgins, and after that we have music, or actually a performance, I should say. It's not just music; it's more than that. And then we will listen to another presentation about deforestation. Then we will have a panel conversation, and of course there will also be ample opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you hear something that you would like to know more about, just store it, and at the end of the evening I'll get back to you. So let me introduce our first speaker, who will then in his turn introduce our Freedom Lecturer. His name is Philipp Ambach, and he works at the International Criminal Court, ICC, as the chief of the Victims' Participation and Reparations section of the registry. Wow, that is quite a mouthful. Prior to that, he served for more than 5 years in the presidency of the ICC as the President's Special Assistant since 2010. And he holds a PhD in International Criminal Law of the Free University of Berlin. Philip, we are very, very pleased to have you in our midst, and I would like to give the floor to you to introduce our Freedom Lecturer of tonight. Philip.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Do you hear me? Great, excellent. Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a great honor to be here tonight, and in particular, it's a great honor for this topic. It's not only the topic, but it's also the two of us that go back a couple of years on this topic. And I must say that I think ecocide is something that when we first talked, I thought, like, okay, did I misunderstand something? We're talking about genocide. No, it is a different topic altogether. It is something that is maybe linked, and we'll hear much more from Polly on how this could actually be looking at pretty much similar parameters. But I think that since we know each other, I have been delving into the topic a lot more, because it actually created my own a private interest, and I thank you for that. As I'll try to sort of flag a couple of points that will, I'm pretty sure, be picked up by Polly in much more detail. But I think it also gives us a little bit of a couple of ideas of where we actually stand and what this strange animal of ecocide actually is. Let me maybe put it in a couple of questions. And my first question would be, what is actually ecocide? And an interesting, different definition which I've seen is intentional destruction of the environment. It doesn't really fit exactly into the shoes of ecocide, but it's, I think it gives us an initial idea. A much better definition I found on the homepage of Polly's NGO, and that is this. Ecocide is the extensive damage to, destruction of, or loss of ecosystems of a given territory to such an extent that peaceful enjoyment by the inhabitants of that territory has been or will be severely diminished. In other words, what are we looking at? We're looking not at any national catastrophe, anything that is not made by human hands. So sort of your plague, earthquake, flood, a comet falling on a city, that is surely not what we're talking about when it's about ecocide, but we're looking at the man-made damage to an ecosystem. And the definition also sets a certain threshold, and that is interesting for, in particular, those that are interested in the legal ramifications. We have a gravity threshold here, which is the extensiveness. It needs to be an extensive impact on the ecosystem. And second, effect, integrity, usability of the territory needs to be severely diminished. So these are two ingredients that you also know from your national codes. Examples are surely the use of Agent Orange in Vietnam. Operation Ranch Head, wiping out 20% of Vietnam's forests and 50% of its swamps. Atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki surely also points to be discussed. Kuwait setting fire to 700 oil wells in 1991. Usage of cluster bombs with depleted uranium in much more recent armed conflicts. Or the poisoning of water wells in Darfur, Sudan. I could continue, and you see that I've just been moving on into the present with my examples. What do these examples have in common? They relate to armed conflict. But that's only part of the truth for ecocide. Ecocide goes further than that. Ecocide is not only a phenomenon of war, but also one that occurs in peacetime, where state agents or private companies exploit environmental resources. And the effect of that is then massive, long-lasting environmental damage. One example being mining industry, Latin America and Africa. And another one is the desiccation of the Aral Sea between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. The fourth biggest lake, formerly, of this globe, which has since been diminished to almost nothing. And that is a huge economic catastrophe, which would clearly fall into this because it is man-made as an economic catastrophe. Second question, why do we need to act? Why do we need Polly? Why are we here? One could say that, well, actually we don't need to act. We have national legislation. Dutch criminal code provides for punishment for those that impact with their wrongdoings on the environment. We're looking at a maximum of 6 years imprisonment and 760,000 euros of fine for companies. Not bad, one could say. Same goes for many other European countries. European Union Directive, 2008-99, actually forces states to also have national criminal sanctions for pollution of the environment. And finally, also international conventions like the so-called NMOD, the Convention on the Prohibition of Military and Any Other Hostile Use of Environmental Modification Techniques, an international treaty that binds states. Other important international declarations, like Stockholm Declaration 1972, Rio Declaration 1992, I could continue. Problem is, they all have massive limitations, and let me tell you about those. National context is fine for us in developed countries. Look at all the other 190-odd states, and you will find that not all countries have any forceful legislation. Same goes for the regional context. What we have in the European Union might not necessarily be the case for other areas. Then, when it comes to the international treaties, how much of them are actually binding? How much of them are actually providing for an enforcement regime? Because it's one thing whether, as a state, I sign and ratify a beautifully sounding declaration, but it's another thing if there is no enforcement regime. I don't have to do anything about wrongdoings on my territory. And finally, what happens in wartime? In wartime, anyways, many of these obligations of states sort of fall over the wayside. So the third reason why we actually need to think about this is because it all affects us every day. Environmental destruction is something that is concerning any single one of us because we only have one planet, and if that is being destroyed, it affects us every single day. It violates fundamental human rights. And again, this is something that I'm pretty sure Polly will pick up. She's clearly picking up on her homepage, which I suggest everyone may have a look at. It's extremely informative. Those individuals targeted by environmental destruction are also targeted, and their human rights are affected. And finally, one very essential thing, and this is where my job comes in a little bit in terms of the International Criminal Court, there's a link between the environment, human conflict, and economic factors. And that is, a war today, in most cases, is resource wars. So what we're looking at is wars for resources, wars through resources. I maintain my war effort because I can actually use natural resources in order to buy weapons and thereby exacerbate my power, area, or structure. Those that don't have natural resources suffer. Suffering creates unrest. Unrest creates conflict. So it works both ways, and it works negatively. We have proof for this in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Haiti. Environmental damage has been at least one of the causes for massive, decade-long armed conflict. In the 1990s only, we're looking at 5 million people killed in armed conflicts relating to the exploitation of natural resources. So I think we all agree that we have to do something. But what do we have to do? And that actually now goes to the question of what exactly is it that we can do? And I think that there's two big questions here to ask. The first one is, who is our perpetrator? Whom do we look at? And the first one is states. We have to look at states because there needs to be international instruments that put an active duty on states to, first, desist themselves from applying any techniques that would, for economic gain, deplete natural resources and actually destroy the natural resources. Second, force non-state actors operating on their territory to abide by these same rules. That is, enacting proper legislation and an enforcement regime. And three, acknowledge a duty to protect the environment and their population. Again, one of the leading topics that we're going to hear more on. Second level, the individual. What do I mean by that? I mean that if we all agree that environmental protection is something that concerns us all, I think we can also agree that somebody who violates that in a sufficiently grave manner is actually somebody who should be punished for that through a crime. And here we're looking at the individual criminal responsibility of your state actor, that is your head of state, your Minister of Foreign Affairs, the warlord, that is the non-state actor, the CEO of Company X, that is exploiting a mine somewhere and dumping all the chemicals in some river, which actually creates a huge nature disaster further down the stream, or your military actor that uses natural resources in order to pursue their war efforts. What do we have? We have the Rome Statute of the place where I work, the International Criminal Court. What does this give us? Not much. We have a war crime provision that provides for the criminal prosecution of somebody who, in a very grave manner, destroys the environment to pursue their own war effort, which is no longer proportional to that war effort. I would think that, for instance, the use of Agent Orange in Vietnam would fall into that category, but already with the atomic bomb over Hiroshima, you can enter into a discussion because these bombs ended the war, say some. So all of a sudden you're already in a big discussion on something where all of us, I think, agree that that must squarely fall into that realm of ecocide. Therefore, I think Polly is on the absolute right track, that we're looking at the necessity for an own crime, a sui generis crime of crime against the environment, ecocide. The name doesn't matter, the content is relevant here. And in conclusion, I think that once we have that crime and we move on and inject this into regional treaties, into hybrid tribunals that are operating in the field in order to hold people criminally responsible for crimes committed in certain war scenarios. And we move the definition further, we move its use further. I think this is where we're going to get into a new era of crime, which further down the line may become an additional crime to the Rome Statute. But I think that we first need to take the first steps, and I think that Polly is the one that is doing this very first step, and it's a duty for all of us to help her in doing that. And this brings me to the point where I actually introduce Polly as today's freedom lecturer, and she will surely enlighten you much more than I could on all these points, and I'm extremely privileged to meet you. And I think I don't need to introduce much more than that, and I just give you the floor like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. Philip, thank you. Freedom. What is freedom? Universal values. Well, for me, freedom is something that I greatly value. And indeed, if we are to value a greater freedom for humanity at large, then surely that means that we take on board a principle of first do no harm in a wider international, transnational context. When we have transnational corporations causing significant harm under the ambit of legal operations, where does that leave us? Where does that leave indigenous communities whose land is destroyed? Where does that leave us when we lose huge, vast tracts of forest, when, in fact, communities don't just lose their biodiversity and their wildlife, but they lose their ability to farm because no longer does it rain anymore, because the forests are no longer there to create the atmospheric conditions to live in peaceful enjoyment. But this is also about our peaceful enjoyment and our children's peaceful enjoyment and our children's peaceful enjoyment. What are the ticking time bombs that we're putting in place here today that will have significant adverse impact for many generations to come? What does that mean in terms of how we adversely impact the earth that leads to resource depletion, that leads to conflict far further down the line? So what is it that we can stem the flow of today that will prevent the wars of tomorrow? Problem is when do we actually get to that point where we say, no, enough? Do we say, well, the adverse impact is so little and it's over there, we needn't worry about it? Or do we wait until so much further down the line that we're actually at war over resources, whether or not it's water or food? This is ultimately about taking responsibility. And indeed, I've spent 7 years now talking, advising, advocating for a law of ecocide. And in a way, it's an emergent space because over those last 7 years, how we approach the world has also changed. And in fact, something happened last year that made me critically analyze my own proposal. And that was the Paris Agreement back in April. In fact, I was in New York for that very agreement, for the signing of it. And I came away from that event where 197 countries had turned up, whether or not it was heads of states or ministers, to sign that document, realizing that something seismic had shifted from 7 years earlier. It was now impossible for any state to say, I didn't know that what we were doing is causing harm to the environment. I didn't know that what we're doing in terms of industrial activity is contributing to excess greenhouse gas emissions. I didn't know that that was going to have adverse impact and increased temperatures, which leads to catastrophic climate change. We can't say that anymore. In fact, we've signed a document to say that we recognise that it's so dangerous that we must prevent it from escalating above 1.5 degrees centigrade, an increase of temperature. So where does that leave us? Well, in terms of an ecocide law, you could say there's a recklessness here. We have a document, it's just an agreement that's been signed by many countries. As Philipp mentioned, many of these international treaties have very little enforcement mechanisms, just like the Paris Agreement. It's nice words on a piece of paper, born of 21 years of climate negotiations. But what has this got to do with ecocide law, you might ask yourself? Well, as Philipp quite rightly said, ecocide law is to do with largely state crime and corporate crime, dangerous industrial activity. But there is another ecocide at play as well. And I believe it's equally important, and that's climate ecocide. That's actually the naturally occurring ecocide that is escalated by human-caused ecocide. There is a nexus between the two. Very difficult to establish a causal link between one company's industrial activity and rising sea levels and tsunamis and cyclones and typhoons in the Pacific, for instance. But we do know that it is linked, and we do accept that under the Paris Agreement, that there is a causal link between dangerous industrial activity and escalating climate change. And with that responsibility come not just moral duties and obligations, but arguably also legal duties and obligations. Now, at the moment, it's not a crime to commit ecocide. It's not a crime to continue with what could constitute as dangerous industrial activity. The carbon majors of this world, there was a fantastic body of research undertaken, took 8 years to complete, and Friends of the Earth, I think, were involved in this. The report's online if you Google carbon majors, and it identifies the 68 top companies in the world who are contributing the majority of climate emissions. They are the carbon majors. 68 companies in the world. When you look at it through that lens, you can find yourself saying, well, surely governance of 68 CEOs and attendant directors can't be that difficult. Far more difficult to create a governance system over billions of people in the world. But if we attend upstream to those who are contributing at the highest level, think how we could turn this sinking ship, if you like, around. So I'd like to look more at the climate ecocide, because this is something that's not talked about so much. Often with ecocide as a crime, we look at it in terms of just the dangerous industrial activity. But if you're a sinking state, you have two core issues. One, the assistance that's required. It's not about mitigation if you're going underwater. And indeed, it's not even about adaptation. I don't know, some of you might have seen back in 2009 when the Maldives held parliament underwater to prove this very point. So what do you do when you're left without a lifeline? For those of you who have tracked the climate negotiations, you probably know that 3 weeks before the climate negotiations in Paris last year, a year and a bit ago, there was in fact a provision, it was a very important provision, that was to be in the final text. And that was the Climate Displacement Coordination Facility. A rather technical term for what basically meant migration with dignity. If you're going underwater, you need to move to safe land. And this was a provision to help migrate with dignity. Now, there's a recent report that's come out that's identified that over 750 million people, this is a huge humanitarian crisis, existential crisis, 750 million people will become environmental refugees by 2050. To give you a sense of that number, where would we put 750 million people? At the moment, we have 65 million environmental refugees, UNEP declared a few months ago. So we've got an escalation happening here, tenfold escalation and more. But where do we put them? At the moment, our refugee camps, there are 20 of them in the world, and the largest one only takes 1 million people. It's in Colombia. It was a temporary camp that was set up 21 years ago, and now some people are being born and dying behind barbed wire. Is this really a humanitarian way to deal with refugees, and in particular environmental refugees? Think of the collective trauma that occurs for those who lose their land. It's land grabs by another means. It's land grabs by the sea, if you will, and not of their own making. And yet, it's contributed to at an international level. So for those states, those sinking states, if you will, this is a two-pronged issue. One, it's about creating a legal duty of care to give assistance. But the second one is equally to do with climate justice, and that's about closing the door to the dangerous industrial activity that is exacerbating the naturally occurring ecocide, the climate ecocide. So where does this leave us? Well, I attended the Assembly of State Parties back in November in The Hague, and it was very telling that hardly any of those small island developing states that are most adversely impacted by climate ecocide, if you will, weren't in attendance. In fact, there are 54 small island developing states. 25 of them are signatories already to the Rome Statute. Hardly any of them were there. Why were they not there? Well, here's the interesting thing. You know, when we attend the Assembly of State Parties, the whole of Europe are signatories to the Rome Statute. We just get on an EasyJet flight, or if we're more environmentally conscious, a train. It doesn't cost very much. £99 flight. But to fly over from some Pacific island, to send a couple of delegates, that's a €20,000 exercise immediately. But more than that, a lot of these small island developing states that are already signatories, they have debt to the International Criminal Court, which precludes them from participating because they can't pay their fees. How does this work out? Well, you have a cyclone and it wipes out half your GDP overnight. You have a tsunami. It wipes out half your GDP overnight. What do? Do you put 20,000 to get a couple of delegates over to a meeting in The Hague? 20,000 could maybe rebuild 200 houses. That's a lot of lives that need to be taken care of. There's an emergency situation here where you have to prioritize where you put your funds. But if you have an international criminal court that's dealing with war crimes, crimes of conflict, crimes that deal with situations that are not in alignment with your crisis, your climate crime, if you like, then where are you going to go? So there's a huge imbalance in the scales of justice here, that those who are most requiring assistance don't even get a seat at the table of the Assembly of State Parties through lack of finance. Now, how much does it cost for an annual fee for a small island state, developing state? anything between 1,000 and 2,000 euros. That's an annual fee. To us, that's nothing. But to a small island developing state that sees it as, well, 5 years debt paid, yet to be paid out to the International Criminal Court, sending the delegates, paying for the hotel, paying for added infrastructure and assistance while you're over there, probably having a team of 4, maybe 6 people. It suddenly becomes a 50,000, 60,000 euro exercise, and that's just one state. Where do you choose to put your finance? Often when you're in a state of crisis, you're firefighting at a very base level, and you're so busy trying to deal with what's happening just to survive that you can't even see above the parapet to see what could give assistance in the longer term. And this is a fundamental problem that we have. We're in a beautiful position in the Western world where we're able to actually attend an awful lot of these meetings, but those who are most in crisis don't. And so their voices don't get heard. And so then the issues that are brought up are not the ones that really need to be spoken about. Now, there was one small island developing state that attended the Assembly of State Parties. And they sent their Minister of Justice to speak. And he gave a great speech about the climate injustice he was seeing playing out and the disproportionality as well. But what was very interesting there was that they sent the Minister of Justice. It wasn't a trade issue for them. It's not an economic issue. It wasn't an environmental issue. It was a justice issue for them. And that's the thing. Ecocide is a justice issue. Now, something that I've come across quite recently, which has really helped me, and you're going to be hearing from Tim speaking afterwards, is what's called the governance triangle. Is that right? The governance hierarchy. Enforcement hierarchy. And Tim is a criminology expert. The enforcement hierarchy looks at what we put in place and how it operates. And at the very bottom end, you have essentially what's known as soft law. So agreements, treaties, protocols. But it has no legal teeth. At a national level, this can be something that can be done sometimes through arranged inspections of companies, for instance. And you start moving up that hierarchy and you get to a kind of, the second level is compliance, often through regulatory enforcements. The problem is that compliance through regulatory enforcements only really works for those who want to comply. It's predicated on cooperation. But if you're a company who's making an awful lot of money out of something that's causing a lot of harm, whether or not it's legal or illegal, you're not going to be interested in cooperation. And so as you move up that hierarchy of governance, you start to step into another arena, and that's using criminal provisions. And that's very important because that's when you start to hold individual decision makers to account, and not just within the corporate world, but also state as well. Often where you see highest levels of environmental destruction, you'll also find attendant to it as well, very high levels of state engagement with it. And that's because of corruption. And there's a nexus between the illegal activities and making those illegal activities legal. So where you may have a country that does actually have enforcement mechanisms in place and therefore looks at, for instance, logging as illegal and has some mechanisms to enforce that. Well, because we live in a world that's so transnational in its operations, it's very easy to wash illegal logging, for instance, deforestation, from one country into another and move it through other channels where it can be given a permit through backhand doors, and whether or not you have corrupt politicians or you have enforcement officers who will turn a blind eye. So we have a problem here when, in fact, the enforcement itself is piecemeal and limited in remit, often just to one nation state. In fact, I met him in The Hague at the Peace Palace, the Wildlife Justice Commission. Were examining wildlife crime in Vietnam. And indeed, there was a video there where there was a discourse about the problems with their own enforcement, because Vietnam, like 9 other countries, actually has ecocide in its criminal penal code. 10 countries in the world have it as a crime. But their biggest problem with wildlife crime is that, of course, it's transnational in its very remit. What happens in their country is then exported out, and it happens by corporations that they can't touch because they're not hidebound by their own national legislation. They require international law to intervene here. So we have a problem here in terms of not just the law that's required, but also the enforcement as well. So where does this leave us? It seems as if it's a terribly bleak situation. But maybe that's it. Maybe that's when we are really required to stand up and take action. Now, you, sir, mentioned values and purpose. You're talking to companies about that. And more companies are engaging in that. But one of the biggest problems you have is that if you don't have a level playing field, and it's going to adversely impact your bottom line, you're not going to change your practices. Even if personally you think it's wrong to cause such mass damage and destruction within your operations. About 6 years ago, I spoke at Shell's AGM in the UK. And that was a very telling experience. It was also a very scary experience. It was held in the Barbican, which is our largest theatre in Barbican number 1 in London. And there were a number of activists that had come over from the Niger Delta, as well as from Canada, from the Athabasca tar sands, indigenous leaders who'd come to speak about the huge adverse impact of oil extraction on their land and on their people. Not just ecological ecocide, but also cultural ecocide. How their people were sick and ill as a result of the pollution to their waterways, the very fact that they could no longer eat the fish that, as indigenous people, they would normally fish, the very fact that the animals they normally used to hunt now no longer exist. The very fact that what used to be ancient wetlands have now become toxic tailing ponds, sometimes as long as 200 kilometers. And I went there armed with a body of evidence. Now, the thing is, often when you speak at these shareholder resolutions, you have maybe 3 minutes to speak. And I thought long and hard about what was it that I could say that might have some impact. And I brought evidence of the adverse impact on birds in the Athabasca tar sands. And what I saw was very interesting. I had my evidence there, which was born of NGOs in Canada going in and investigating the adverse impact. Between 22 and 27 million birds fly across the Athabasca tar sands. It's one of the 4 main migratory routes for North American birds. And they stop to land on the Athabasca Peace Delta every year. Birds don't know the difference between a toxic tailing pond and a wetland. Now, the numbers of birds that are lost every year is huge. In fact, it's almost uncalculable. It's so difficult to actually keep track of these numbers. That's just one aspect of the adverse impact of unconventional tar extraction. And I asked the question, surely does this not mean that you have a responsibility, not just to the birds, not just to the water, not just to the land, not just to the atmosphere that you're polluting, not just for the people who live there, but for future generations. Now, I stepped back from speaking at that shareholder, that AGM, and I found myself walking away with a very heavy heart, thinking this is a company that really doesn't want to face up to its responsibilities. And why should it? Hey, it's not a crime. But maybe, just maybe, now is the time. There's something happening here that if we are to recognize our true freedom in this world, it's about taking responsibility for each other. And not just for humans, but for all inhabitants of a given territory. And not just for that given territory, but for those outside that territory. Because what we do here has significant adverse impact elsewhere. And this is why I propose ecocide law. But this is also why I now stand and say it's no longer sufficient to say this is a crime of consequence. The CEO of Shell 6 years ago did something remarkable after I spoke at that AGM. He and his team were sitting on the platform on stage, and it's a theatre. So there was a theatre pit underneath where the orchestra normally plays. And I was standing in a podium up where the audience normally sit. The then CEO of Shell, when everyone was getting off the stage, he did something remarkable. He jumped off the stage down into the pit, which was about 6 foot deep, the orchestra pit. But it was the only way he could get into the audience, because there was a little stairwell up there. And he came and he pushed through the crowds, and there was a lot of animosity there. There were a lot of activists there who were really very angry at what Shell was doing. And he came, he pushed through, and there were about 5,000 people, and he grabbed me and pulled me aside. And he said something remarkable to me. He said, despite all appearances to the contrary, some of us really do care. And in that moment, I really knew he did care. And he said to me, I don't know about this adverse impact on the birds. Nobody told me. I handed him this body of evidence and told him that this had been sent to his office. I knew that. I'd spoken to the NGO concerned. But he hadn't received it because of the gatekeepers and possibly the lawyers who knew to keep that evidence away. He didn't know what that adverse impact was. Now, back then, I was arguing that ecocide is a crime of consequence. Now I say no. Actually, there is a mental element. There's a recklessness. If you don't know, you really should know. To be in a position as CEO of Shell UK at that time and not know what that adverse impact was is truly remarkable. Now, when I did my due diligence on that man, what I discovered was he's an ornithologist. And he didn't know about that adverse impact, and he didn't. There is a duty that is incumbent upon us, and in fact is a principle that's known within international criminal law, the principle of superior responsibility, that the higher up the chain of command and control you are, whether or not as a CEO and director, whether or not you're heading up an army as a general, then the higher the burden, the higher the mantle of responsibility that you carry. And that applies to heads of state, ministers. That actually there's a recklessness. Either you knew and you acted, or you should have known and you acted, and you still caused harm. And that's about accountability at the very top end. Because here's the interesting thing. Those that really care actually will find this is a law that really assists them. If we go back to those situations with illegal logging and the corruption that's endemic, often in African states, for instance, it helps if there's an international crime in place for that minister or permit allocator or that politician to say, no, I can't give this to you because I'll end up in jail, as will you. Because this is the thing about ecocide law. It's a protector's law. It protects us, humanity. It protects state actors who wish to do the right thing. And it protects not just the indigenous world, but it protects future generations, those that come behind us. So this is about how we take responsibility here and now to put in place a law that paves the way to greater freedom and greater peace for us all. Thank you.
Polly Higgins, ladies and gentlemen. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Can I ask you to join me at the table? Have a seat. Thank you so much for enlightening us. Well, let me speak for myself. Me, I learned a lot. You actually quit your job as a lawyer once to actually start being the advocate of the earth. What was that defining moment for you?
Yeah, I didn't know it then, but it was explained to me a number of years later. It was a critical choice point in my life. And in fact, I've since discovered that we maybe have 6 or 7 critical choice points in our life. There are moments, the crossroad moments, where you can choose to continue with life as usual, business as usual, or you can step off that safe route and step into the unknown. And in a way, what happened to me was exactly that. It was a critical choice point. I found myself in court. My background is not environmental law, it's corporate law, which is why I understand the mind of the corporation far better. I was representing an individual who'd been very badly injured and harmed in the workplace. It was a whistleblowing case. And it was Judgment Day in our criminal courts, in our civil courts in London, and this had been a 3-year-long running case. So we were waiting for the outcome and the judges to come back in, but there was a delay. And it was one of these moments where your world opens up, and I found myself looking out the window and thinking, it's not just my client that's been badly injured and harmed here, so is the earth. I was in a courtroom at the very top of the building, overlooking London, trees, fields, buildings, and looking out, and I found myself kind of metaphorically soaring above the building right across the world and thinking, something needs to be done about this. By the time I'd actually returned to my chambers after that case, which I won in part, in fact I changed the law on that day, and my clerks were very excited and they were saying, Miss, this is great, you know, the world is yours, you can take on any big case now, you've hit the big league. And I said, yeah, and I'm going to take a year out now. And that was 12 years ago now, and I'm still on my year out. And as I had to admit to my bank manager recently, I'm not going back either. No.
Would you describe yourself as an activist today?
Do you know, this is something that comes up only in the Netherlands. It's very interesting. I don't know what it is with this country. You really like this word. I think to be an activist, I think of the people who are doing the real courageous, daring do stuff. They're the ones that are, you know, out there at the front line, stopping the bulldozers coming in. They're the guys that, you know, are climbing up the sides of, you know, big chimneys. They're the ones that are getting on the boats in the Arctic and, you know, freezing. They're, well, getting very cold in the process. You know, these are the women and the men who are really doing the courageous activist stuff. In truth, I'm just a humble lawyer. And I'm just putting my unique skills to the best possible use that I can here. So it would be disingenuous to say, in truth, that I'm an activist. Am I taking action? Well, I am from my place as a lawyer, putting my unique skills to best possible use. But I have to say, I look at those who have far greater courage than I have. I get out of my comfort zone standing up and speaking in the public. How it must be to tie yourself to a ship in freezing water, that is where true courage lies and true activism lies.
So can you tell us a little bit more about your strategies to obtain your goals? So, what are your most important allies? Is it mainly a political lobby, or is it more in the public domain? How do you see that?
Well, it's not one particular sector. It seems to be there's a golden thread here, and the golden thread is care. Those who really care about what's happening in the world at the moment. I mentioned I was in New York back in April, and in fact I was over in Washington and then over the West Coast. And everywhere I went, I met Americans who would say, wow, this is really extreme, and we need an extreme response to what's happening. We're worried about this guy called Trump. And the primaries were going on at that time. Everywhere I went, I ended up in the city where the primaries were happening that day. And it was so interesting, this kind of response of, we need something extreme. And I was trying to point out, I don't know if this is extreme. This is a natural progression of where law is going. And in fact, if you talk to progressive lawyers, they see this as an inevitability. And indeed, it pops up in different continents in different ways. And, lawyers starting to speak out, saying one day this is going to be recognized as a crime, whether or not you're looking at deforestation, fracking, unhealthy mining practices, or what have you. So it's this golden thread of care. And it comes sometimes from the most unlikely of allies as well. Because you can have individuals working within, for instance, big transnational corporations that are really causing a lot of ecocide who do genuinely care. I mean, that CEO of Shell back then 6 years ago, he cared. That was absolutely clear. Interestingly, he stepped down early 6 months later. I don't know why, and went on to do something to do with carbon emissions instead.
No, nothing with birds.
Well, maybe birds, yeah, maybe, yeah. But, this is the thing. In a way, it's expanding your vision of what's possible. And so it's an important narrative in itself to engage people to actually start stepping outside the box of what is and looking into the realms of what could be and what can we really do here. And I think that's really important here. Because actually what this comes down to is finance and political will. And both of those can be overcome.
Yeah, when we were having dinner just now, I asked you if you were actually an optimist.
Yeah.
You said yes, but also a realist.
Yeah, and a pragmatist. Yeah. I am pragmatic. At the end of the day, I think it's very important to look at this pragmatically, because if we keep on moving through this world with shutters, then we will allow business as usual to continue. And we can't. We have to take responsibility for this. So there is a pragmatic reality here to say, okay, we have to attend to this now. There's something that has to be done. Yeah.
Do you think it's likely that within the next 50 years we will actually see the implementation of ecocide law in international law? Is that feasible? Is that realistic?
I really hope it's earlier than that, because I have a dream. I have this big dream to go off around the world on the back of a Harley Davidson, electric one, and or I could be riding it. I could have someone on the back of it. But 50 years down the line, I'm going to be too old to do that. Actually, we can move far faster. 50 years is a very long timeline, and indeed, in truth, sometimes when change comes, it can come very, very fast. And indeed, that's always the case. I remember I was living in Vienna as a student. I was 21 at the time. And there was a huge amount of noise, a huge amount of television coverage around the Berlin Wall. Was it going to come down eventually? And I remember saying to my friend's father, I was staying with at the time, do you really think the Berlin Wall will come down? And he said, no, it's never going to happen in our lives. It'll take at least 50 years. 3 weeks later, it came down. 3 days later, we were sitting at dinner and said, well, of course we knew it was going to come down. But what had happened there, he'd fundamentally shifted his perspective of what was possible. 3 weeks ago, it had been impossible for him. As soon as it happened, of course it was possible. Now, what happened in the interim, he wasn't privy to, but something happened that allowed that to shift very, very fast.
So what do you think is going to be that tipping point for ecocide? I think a lot of people are looking for that. How do we get more people aware?
Well, here's something that actually I asked a former Prime Minister of yours, Ruud Lubbers, because I heard a very interesting story about the falling of the Berlin Wall, and I'm very interested in what are those critical choice point moments. Where do you take the opportunity? What is it that happens? And here's the story that I'd heard, and I asked Ruud Lubbers about this. Mikhail Gorbachev went to do a walk around the Berlin Wall the day before it fell. And I didn't see it on television, but it was widely televised. And what he did was he went into the crowds, so much so that the cameras couldn't hear what he was saying, so much so that his bodyguards weren't with him. And he was taking people's hands, and he was grabbing their hands and saying, now is your moment. I'll make sure the troops aren't brought in. Now is your moment. I'll make sure the troops don't come in. That night, the wall came down. And I asked Ruud Lubbers about this, and I said, is this true? He said, well, the wording's maybe not quite right, but the sentiment is correct, yes. Now, that's a huge insight to what happened there. It took huge courage from a political leader to bridge the gap between the activists who were there shouting to have that wall pulled down, and between the political world to make sure that the political world didn't take a knee-jerk reaction and bring in the troops. Who are these bridges? Who are these political actors who are able to stand up with great leadership and authority to take that forward? But he needed, it couldn't be a political actor on his own, he needed the grassroots activists. It was the two acting in concert that made it happen.
And the synchronicity of both, or
yes.
all involved.
Yeah.
Wonderful example. I think it's time to actually listen to some inspiration. And today that inspiration will come from singer Lilian Vieira, who will actually be performing poetry for us today. And it's very special poetry Lilian will be performing. She will be performing poetry by Brazilian poet and environmentalist Astrid Cabral. And Cabral is actually one of Brazil's leading contemporary poets, a native of Manaus, the capital city of Amazonas state, and a key figure in the Amazonian cultural identity and recovery movement. Her poems are firmly rooted in an Amazonian childhood, populated by parrots, monkeys, turtles, bats, pink river dolphins, boa constrictors, and other rainforest creatures. And we are very happy and pleased that we have Lilian Vieira with us today to perform 3 poems from the collection Cage, together with Kees Gelderbloem on guitar. Ladies and gentlemen, Lilian Vieira.
nome aos bois. Vamos dar nome aos bois. Antes de nos perdermos pelos currais e pastos, cerrados, ermos gerais. Vamos dar nome aos bois. E mais, vamos despir o lobo hóspede velhaco do pelo da ovelha vítima. Já é tempo de fazer jus e discernir as serpentes, devidamente chamá-las corais, cascavéis, sucurijus. Mas como nomear ou batizar os bois que não são bois? As inéditas e fantásticas bestas que infestam nossos prados sem cerca, com seus anônimos tropéis, urros e berros insólitos, suas bostas como bólidos de planetas ultra remotos. Bois que, por se não serem bois, afivelam asas de dragões e não consentem que palavra alguma lhes capture as patas, as armadilhas de fonemas ou lhe curve os cangotes sobre o cabresto das palavras. Vamos dar nome aos bois e chamar os dicionários de burros de tão mudos, pois as 3 malhadas manadas de bois que não são bois, como vamos chamá-las? Pena. Sinto pena, vendo efêmeras formigas correndo, trôpegas na terra, e céleres colibris sugando ávidos flores provisórias. Lembro matas, castanheiras circulares, torres nas alturas dos ares. Lembro os rios, quinhentonas tartarugas quase eternas nas águas. Castanheiras, tartarugas, teriam pena de mim? Eu, formiga ou colibri?
Lilian Vieira, ladies and gentlemen, with Kees Gelderblom on guitar. Thank you so much. Muito obrigada. We will see you later again. And we will continue our conversation, Polly, but first let me invite to join us on stage and to present actually to us Tim Boekhout van Solinge. He is a geographer, but also a criminologist who specializes in eco-crime and forest crime, in particular illegal logging, you already mentioned it, and deforestation in equatorial forests. And in recent years, Tim focused on illegal logging and land grabbing in the Brazilian Amazon, and recently ended his career at university to fully commit himself to forest crime consultancy, another one of those crossroads situations. And we're very pleased that you're with us today, Tim, to give us a brief overview of actors, causes and effects of deforestation, and also talk a little bit about the role of criminology in the regard of deforestation. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Boekhout van Solinge.
Yes, good evening, everybody. I'm going to have a presentation that's quite visual. I'm going to show you some maps, some satellite images, and then slowly on I'm going to take you to the Amazon. I assume most of you have never been there. And so I'm going to show you some pictures on the ground as well. So I'm going quickly, a lot of images. Don't write down, if you want to know the statistics, you can maybe call me or email me later on, or you can find them in public, but okay. Let's go. Well, first about me, I'm originally a geographer, later turned into a criminologist. You will see a bit of both of them. As a geographer, as you will see, I like maps. I think to visualize things is very, very important and makes it much clearer. And later on I became a criminologist. I had specialties in drugs, but later on I moved more to eco-crime and especially forest crime. Well, let's first, deforestation is high on the agenda of the United Nations. Why? The main reason is climate change. Deforestation is an important contributor to CO2 emissions, and also for the UN, limiting deforestation is an important strategy to stop CO2 emissions. Now here you get some, this is what we lost. So here you can see, in the 1990s, the world lost forest the size of Australia. Then in the first decade of this century, the world lost forest the size of India, and between 2010 and 2015, we lost an area the size of Mongolia. It means actually it was going down a little bit here, the trend, but it's going up a little bit here. So this is what we're really losing. If you look, where are we losing this? This is actually where it becomes really worrisome. And one of the things I do is I write a lot about deforestation in the equatorial rainforest. Equatorial rainforest along the equator. And if you look here, so green means there's more forest, red means forest disappearing. You can see where's the forest disappearing? Well, it's along the equator, and talking about ecocide and biodiversity, this is also where you find the most, well, biodiversity is highest. I mean, the known species, of course, the orangutans, you find them only on 2 islands. Look here, if you think about gorillas and the bonobos, they're all only in Central Africa. Or the most biodiverse region on the planet, the Amazon rainforest. So the most biodiverse regions are also the most threatened by deforestation and consequently a threat of biodiversity. So this is what's going on. Now, when I started this in 2002, I decided, okay, let's look in the country where it's going. And so this is the interior of Borneo. And at the time, this was 2005, I thought logging is the main cause of deforestation. And it is an important cause of deforestation. And here you see this is a national park of Indonesia, and this is all logs, it's Meranti timber, and it's logged illegally. It's even sawn in the forest. I looked there, and it's a lot of people are making money on this, and this is really large-scale trafficking, of course, 20 kilometers from Malaysia in the interior of Borneo, and then it becomes Malaysian, and and it's exported. Well, actually, we don't know what happens then, but we do know that, well, the Netherlands, for example, is the first destination of timber from Malaysia, and this is Meranti timber. It's actually very popular. It's one of the most used timber species in our window frames. So maybe it ended up in the Netherlands, but we don't know actually, because it's not very transparent, this business. But actually, timber is important, but this is some recent data from the Union of Concerned Scientists. And if you look here, well, yes, timber is important, but actually, so this is, for the size, contributes to deforestation. If you beef, it's more important than wood. Palm oil gets a lot of attention, but according to the statistics, well, it's actually not that important. You look here, 10% of all the global warming emissions are due to deforestation, and well, Southeast Asia, the Amazon, Central Africa. Here you got it. So this suggests it's beef, and that's probably the true picture. Beef contributes mostly to deforestation on a global scale, and it's especially in the Amazon. I mean, really, 70% of all deforestation in the Amazon has been caused by the creation of cattle farms. Well, you can see it here from the air. More cows than people, over 200 cows now in Brazil, and especially in the Amazon. In Brazilian Amazons, 25 million people living, over 70, 80 million cows. So 3 times more cows than people. Cows are not originally from Brazil. There were no cows in Brazil. These cows come actually originally from India. Cows, Chico Mendes, people, I think maybe from over 45, you probably know him, a famous rubber tapper, and he was killed in the 1870. He was killed by a cattle ranger because, well, this creates conflicts. Cattle rangers want to deforest, and a rubber tapper like Chico Mendes, they wanted to keep the forest. Since Chico Mendes' murder, he was famous, but actually over 200 environmental and land defenders have been killed only in the Brazilian Amazon. And Global Witness, they publish reports about this, and the Amazon is really actually the most dangerous region to be an environmental or land defender. And if you look where in Brazil, where there's actually 2 states, it's Pará state and Mato Grosso state in Brazil where most of these murders are being committed, and it's no coincidence that these are the states with the highest deforestation rates. Some famous victims, Sister Dorothy. I mean, this was, when she was killed in 2005, this was headline news, especially in the United States, where she's from. This was also in the Dutch newspapers. Here you could read when they were killed. The Da Silvas, a famous couple of, the most famous actually in the Amazon, of rainforest protectors, on the very same day that the Brazilian House of Representatives adopted the new forest code, they were killed. I think quite a few people think they were especially, killed on that day to set an example, to threaten other people. But they are the known cases, and so cattle was the main cause of deforestation, but soy cultivation is the second and more recent cause of deforestation. These are some pictures in Pará state. I will go there later on. But this deforestation for beef or soy, again, these two main drivers of deforestation in the Amazon, it's always combined with illegal logging, or legal or illegal logging. But most of the logging and most of the deforestation in Brazil is illegal. So the large majority is illegal. Now, this is some satellite data of Global Forest Watch. What's interesting about this, that here you have a timeline and you can go back. So this was, the red is the forest loss, and then the blue is actually forest gain. Basically, this is plantations. But so this is the red a little bit, this is what deforested in 2001. Now I will go to 2014, so you can see what disappeared in 13 years. Now, let's go on. This is the Brazilian Amazon. And here you can see, so the red was deforested until 2015. The black is a little bit, here and there you find some black. That was deforested in 2016. Altogether, since 1970, 20% has been deforested of the Brazilian Amazon. If you want to know, how big is the Brazilian Amazon? The Brazilian Amazon is bigger than India. Just so it's huge. What has been deforested? The red and the black is twice the size of Japan or twice the size of Germany. Now here you can get a better picture of the Amazon. So the Brazilian Amazon is 2/3 of the total Amazon. So the whole Amazon is twice the size of India. And so this one is already more than one India. And so here you have address. So this is, look here at Peru, for example. So Peru has more than half of its territory in the Amazon. And, but of the complete Amazon, 2/3 is in Brazil. Now these deforestation figures only refer to the Brazilian Amazon, so only to this part here. Now Brazil has an advanced satellite system, and look here, 2004, 27,000 square kilometers. How much is that? That's about 2/3 of the Netherlands. Let's say 8 provinces being deforested in 2004. But the trend of Brazil from 2004 until 2012 was really downward trend. Here, look here, from let's say 8 provinces to maybe 1 Dutch province. I have to put it a bit in Dutch province sizes. So this was maybe one big Dutch province, maybe Gelderland or something, that was deforested. But then it started to increase again, and this is really the worrisome part. I mean, if you look at the recent UN report, and the big environmental success is the decrease, but actually, since 2012, it's increasing again. And now we're here almost 8,000 this year, and it's about the size of North and South Holland combined. So it's increasing again. Now, Pará state, it is on the downstream state, this is the state with most deforestation. To get an idea about the size, this is about the size of Egypt, so about 1,000 and 1,000. Twice the size of France, so it's a huge country. And later on I'm going to focus here, Santarém, which is about 800 kilometers from the sea. And this is the Tapajós River, which you will see a little bit. Just for the idea, there's a lot of brown rivers in the Amazon, but there's 2 clear water rivers. There's the Xingsu River, maybe you've heard about it, there's some dams construction on it here, there's a big conflict about the dams here, but which you probably, most of you haven't heard, there's new dams planned in this one here, the Tapajós River. And the Tapajós River is is considered the most beautiful river in the Amazon, because what's special about these ones, they're clear water river. I mean, we're talking about blue water, and you will see it later on how beautiful this is. Okay, let's go here. Santarém, I was there first time in 2003, there's the River Boulevard. It's high water, low season, the river is 10 meters lower, so then there will be a lot of beach here. You can walk through here. And it's the meeting of the rivers. Here's the Tapajós River, a blue water river, clear water. And here you have the brown Amazon behind there. You think, oh, that's only small? No, because this is just this little island. The Amazon is much wider. So this is already a few kilometers. And here, the meeting at the rivers, we were talking about, maybe 10, 20 kilometers wide, so both with these rivers. When I was the first time, I had just spent 2 days on a boat. I stepped out of the harbor, and I saw all this timber, and the first destination was Vlissingen. I said, wow, all this timber is going to the Netherlands. Yes. So I decided, okay, I have to study this from a criminological perspective. Well, why? It's illegal, of course. A lot of it is illegal. It's also combined with a lot of corruption and violence, and there's many different types of harms. I'm glad you Polly, also used the word harms, but especially in green criminology, the harm principle is very important. And of course, harm is always a basis for criminalizing a certain behavior. If there's no harm, there's no reason to criminalize a certain act. So lots of harms, and I decided to start a project in 2001. I went back. So here you see the Tapajós River. Huge. This is low water. I mean, it's high. In the rainy season, it's all covered with water. So we coordinated a project for a couple of years on conflicts in natural resources, and with universities, NGOs, and justice. Access to justice was one of our strategies. Because we admit a lot of communities, and they say, well, we know our rights are not respected, but how can we get access to justice? Or people say, well, we know there's policeman there, but he works with this large landowner, or he works with this timber trader, so we cannot trust him. So access to justice by working with trustworthy state actors. There's a lot of talk about corruption, but not everybody is corrupt. There's always non-corrupt people, so work with them, make them stronger. That's my strategy. And so we work with public prosecutors. Now, in this part of the Amazon, there's long conflicts about timber. I mean, this is legal logging. This is for Alcoa. Alcoa is here deforesting for bauxite. They say they restore it, but then the communities, they complain because they're taking out sometimes trees of hundreds of years. But Alcoa says they're going to restore it. I'm always surprised how they're going to do that. Traveling through the Amazon, you see over huge piles. Again, usually the normal thing is there are probably papers that show it's legal, but we all know, or many people know, most of it is illegal, and it's no secret for lawyers or enforcement agencies that most of the logging is actually illegal. But the more recent conflict in this part of the Amazon is deforestation for soy. So here you see large soy fields, and the soy, this is only since 2000, because the soy couldn't grow in the tropics, but it's since 2000, Brazilian scientists developed a new soy type for the tropics. And so the soy has entered the Amazon, in the heart of the Amazon, near the Amazon River. And so, so we're going now the heart of the Amazon, because maybe you remember the map where the most deforestation is coming from the south, but here's the Amazon River, and deforestation and movement in. So here's Santarém. So this was deforestation in 2001. I was here in 2003. There was a lot of forest, but this is the situation now. A lot of deforestation, and basically beef and soy, and always combined with timber. But in this part, there's a lot of deforestation for soy. If you travel around here, you have huge soy fields. Now I'm going to show you a few people, activists. No, activists, sorry, that's the wrong word. They're not, they're called activists, here they're called activists, but they say, no, we are protecting our land and our culture and our community. I'm going to show you a few people and where they live. So this is Santarém. I'm going to take you, a community here. There's an indigenous community. They have a conflict with loggers, very violent. And I'm going to take you here. There's this, you can see this is the front line, and if you want big trees, centenary trees, they're over here. So there's conflicts over here. And I'm going to take you to a community over here, near Santarém, an indigenous community who are now suddenly surrounded by soy fields. So, and for the day, to go here, you think, oh, that's just, no, it was, usually takes 2 days to get here by boat. Last time I went there, we rented a speedboat, whole day in a speedboat. And it's a bumpy road because you think, okay, you just have to cross this river here. But the river here is about 10, 15 kilometers wide, and you cannot see the other side. So you think, you're in the open sea and big waves and you name it. Or if you think you just have to cross the Amazon here, but it takes 3 hours on a ferry, just to cross. So about the size. The Tapajós River, the airport of Santarém here. You cannot see it here, but here this is 20 kilometers wide maybe, and but here's a soy barge. Well, these are some of the complaints about people. This is for an indigenous village, and this is their water source. I mean, that's why they live there. There's a source. And behind this, the soy fields, and after the rain, all the fertilizers and pesticides enter the water, and people complain about the pollution of the water. Here you have algae in a river that's normally blue, but here it's algae because of all the fertilizers of soy. Now, Santarém has become a hub. You get soy arriving from other states in big barges, and all the time trucks with soy from other states of southern Brazil and part of the Amazon going to Santarém. Why are they going to Santarém? Because there's this Cargill, which is the biggest company involved in the soy business. They constructed a harbor in Santarém, 800 kilometers from sea, for logistical reasons. So they could, the soy from central Brazil, what used to be exported south, 3,000 kilometers, and now it only has to go 1,000 kilometers north, and it can be exported directly to, well, where? To China and to the Netherlands. So, big ships. So again, this is the Tapajós River, a blue river, and this is the harbor of Santarém. So this is a very normal image to see huge ships all taking soy to be exported. And but it led to a lot of criticism. Actions in McDonald's and all our international actions. So, people didn't want this, deforestation for soy. So there was a soy moratorium installed. And you can read a lot of positive things about this. And there's the agreement is no more deforestation for soy. And companies have signed this. And it's generally presented as successful. You can find a lot of articles on this. And I have some doubt about this because, I don't know. Because what I see in communities, there's still continued deforestation. And actually, if you look, there is still deforestation after 2007. So, and knowing that it's mostly for soy. So something is not right with the moratorium. Now, these are some communities threatened by, surrounded by soy fields. Again, this is an indigenous leader. He lives behind there. We brought him to prosecutors, and here you can see the continued deforestation, which we monitor with GPS. And these are some community leaders that were victims of attacks. This is Dada, an indigenous leader. This is Paulo, they survived the attacks, and I gave them GPS cameras. Of course, this will not protect them, but they live in remote areas where there's no phone, there's no, and now they're very happy with these cameras because they take proof of illegal logging and of land grabbing, and sometimes they catch them because his community, they patrol, and sometimes they catch loggers, and now they can have GPS reference pictures, which probably prosecutors accept as proof. This is the guy in the courtroom. Here he is, because they tried to kill him several times. He managed to get into the federal protection program, so he has a police bodyguard. And in this case, because I was going to the village, and they said, well, we better send the policeman with you, And I was lead author of a report for the United Nations on illegal timber, and one of the conclusions is that, illegal logging is, there's also organized types of logging. And this should be recognized. And one of the good things is that the expert panel said we should use more criminology and also use more science, such as timber forensics, because it can help really to fight illegal timber trade. Is there hope? A good thing is that maybe for the discussion, there's a new head of the United Nations Environment Program, Eric Solheim, a lot of expectations. So, but my view, how I want to conclude. I've lived in the Amazon. I've been thinking nights long, what can we do? And I think, we can only solve this if we have shared responsibility. We should do things over there. People say, yes, corruption, and yes, there is corruption. Things should be improved there, but things should be improved here too. The products, as you see, it's the beef, it's the soy, it's the timber, it's being exported worldwide. So there's also demand side to this market. And so, and generally the consciousness of this is quite low. So I think there's a lot to win. Governments, businesses, everybody can improve, but also I want to emphasize communities. Communities is for me the missing link. The communities are not much involved as yet in forest preservation, and I think they can be involved much more. So that's one of my suggestions. And this is the beach, by the way, the beautiful beach of Santarém. One of the places I miss most. It looks nice. You think, oh, how great. Of course it's nice to swim, but sometimes I was really sad too, sitting on the beach, because sometimes I could see the fires. I remember sitting on the beach, I could see the fires coming out of the forest, which means the flames are 5, 6, 10 meters high. I mean, it's very, well, and it's really sad sitting there and just nobody's stopping the fires, they just continue.
I can tell you are totally passionate about the topic, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut you short,
yes,
because we still have also, we would love to invite you to join us at the table. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim. Thank you very much. Tim Boekhout van Solinge. Very passionate on deforestation in the Amazon. Is deforestation actually the biggest example of ecocide in today's world? Polly?
It's an example. I couldn't tell you if it was the biggest example.
Right.
Certainly if you're looking at significant harm through corporate ecocide per se, it's a big driver. And especially if you're looking at the oil industry as well, then yes, that's a major part of it.
Right. Tim, in what ways do you think we can actually prevent further deforestation? We've seen on your maps that it's going fast, but what can we do now? Which parties need to be mobilized?
Yeah, well, what I noticed, there was also in a newspaper article in NRC Handelsblad, there's a lot of people have trust in satellite monitoring. Oh no, but you have satellite monitoring now. We can see everything. That's true, but it should be followed by action on the ground. And so I noticed that internationally there's this too much belief in satellites. I mean, we should use it, absolutely, but it's often too late, and we should work much more with communities. Yeah. One of my strategies is we should shared interests. Prosecutors, let's say trustworthy prosecutors, they want to protect the forest. Let's connect them to communities who have the same interests, to same interests. And people here have those same interests. Let's see if we can combine that. Some of these cameras were funded by crowdfunding by my former employer, the university. I mean, so that's a way of combining it, you know, and prosecutors are happy too. I mean, you know, these tools, it's empowering institutions and prosecutors, but it's also empowering people. So this was one of the things I believe in. We should work more with technology and communities.
And people.
Yes.
Yeah. Is it happening enough, do you think, Polly? Well, let's say the interdisciplinary approach.
Well, no, obviously not. But it's something that's progressing and it's growing. And I'm also very interested in how you can get these critical interventions. You know, for instance, it's actually very cheap to provide GPS on the ground, and that's something that can bring in a number of different, you know, NGOs, academia, what have you, to help build a body of evidence, if you will, that can then be taken forward. But of course, having evidence is one thing. Having a route for enforcement is another. And especially if you're dealing with transnational corporations, international actors, and you don't have that enforcement ability, then you're stuck.
Yeah, is that also why it's so important to be able to prosecute these parties through international law as opposed to national law?
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and also inter-regional courts, as Philipp was mentioning as well. You know, actually seeing these sorts of things come through on that arena as well. Yeah.
You obviously, in your introduction, already mentioned you're a geographer and a criminologist, which is, I think, a pretty rare combination. I don't know if there are many of you. Probably not, right?
No, probably not.
Probably not. No. So let's try to zoom in a little bit on that aspect. What do you think are some of the challenges that you face while appointing, let's say, or pointing to the responsible actors with regard to eco-crimes in general, but in particular the case that you shed some light on, the deforestation in Brazilian Amazon?
Well, there's the beef, there's timber, and there's the soy. So there's a lot of talk about timber, and there's European policies, soy moratorium, the beef. The main, you don't hear anything about this. So if you, we should talk more about beef, I think. You know, and globally, actually, with CO2 emissions, I mean, beef is huge. It's also a holy cow in the Netherlands. I mean, it's difficult to talk about this, but we should challenge cows. I mean, the number of cows on the planet is really a problem. And so we come to a choice. Do we want a lot of beef, or do we want a lot of rainforests? We cannot have both. You know, we've arrived at that point. And then the companies. There's a lot of greenwashing. That's what I see. I mean, there's Cargill, this company, they're one of the biggest private companies in the world. If you Google them, they have a very green image, and there's a lot of, and if you leave, they say, oh, we're saving the Amazon. That's what this company is presenting about this. I mean, wow, I don't see it, how they're saving the Amazon. I see a lot of destruction of the Amazon because of the presence, what they're doing. And so corporate social responsibility, I sometimes wonder, I thought, wow, it would be interesting to, not that I don't want to bring them to court, but I find it strange, and we call this greenwashing in criminology, that companies can get away with this, that they present themselves as green, whereas I don't see much green. I mean, and it's kind of shocking, especially if you live there. So we're destroying the most biodiverse tropical rainforest, the Amazon rainforest, for cows and for cattle food. Really, that's what's going on. Do we want this? Well, I think first, people don't know this. Most people don't know this. I know this. And the awareness of palm oil is a little bit bigger, but with the beef and the soy. So I think that's where we start. We have to start with public awareness.
Just before I start feeling guilty as a vegetarian, the soy aspect here is actually, in fact, not mainly for human consumption, but it's also for cattle, right?
No, most soy is, I think it's 70–80% of the soy is cattle food, really.
Right.
Yeah. Actually, in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, there's more food for animals arriving than food for humans.
In the port of Rotterdam?
Yes.
How many of you knew that, actually? I'm just curious.
No.
Okay, so we have an expert audience. I guess that much. Well, I didn't know that, and I don't actually read a lot about that. I don't hear a lot about that. Is that also because you already mentioned the corporate lawyers? You were one of them. Is it because they have such a huge interest, literally, in maintaining the status quo? Is that why this matter is so?
No, I'm not entirely sure that's correct. Remember, it is the number one duty of a CEO and his directors is to put the interests of the shareholders first, which basically means to put profit first. Now, that's a huge burden, if you like, if you're sitting there with a conscience. If you're worried about the significant harm, the ecocides that you're causing, ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, if I was a lawyer advising into a big transnational corporation, in effect, I'd be saying quite politely, park your conscience and make sure you maximize your profit. You know, otherwise you're out of a job. So there is a huge problem here that, you know, actually the way the law is structured at the moment is causing problems in its own right. Until we can override that with an overriding legal duty of care that supersedes national corporate law, then we're always going to continue with this problem. Yeah.
So let's go to the national and European government perspective. So what would we need from the Dutch government to start there? What would we need? There's elections coming up. What do people need to actually bear in mind?
You know, I was thinking about this earlier, and I was wondering whether or not there's something critically missing here, and that is an environmental crimes investigation unit. That doesn't exist. You know, it exists in Finland. Because I Googled this earlier and found that Finland does. But actually, in Europe, no. And we're talking about peacetime crime here. I mean, the ICC is predominantly dealing with conflict and war crime. in a way, what I'm advocating is that there's an international crime remit that spreads into peacetime here. There's an imbalance. We have to be looking at peace so that it doesn't escalate into conflict and war. But hey, the International Criminal Court sits here in the Netherlands, in The Hague. Where is that International Environmental Crimes Investigation Unit? And out of that, to identify what are the missing crimes. Obviously, ecocide is part of that. But you can start honing that down. You can start looking at different industries within that.
Right.
I would propose that into your government.
Tim, you mentioned something that I think it was in one of your first slides in Borneo about the logging, where you said that a lot of that timber might actually, I might actually have it in my windowsill, but who knows, because it's so hard to actually follow the supply chain. Now, there are European laws in place, right, that actually prohibit the import of products of unclear whereabouts or backgrounds. How is it actually possible then that I might have very wrong window seals in my house? How
Well, there is a new it's the European Union timber regulations in 2013, so a new law that prohibits that you can no longer import illegally logged timber into the European Union. So great law. But now 3 years later, there's not yet one case in the European Union. And if you look where there's a lot of timber in the Netherlands from Pará State, for example. I spoke to the inspector. So, we get a lot of timber from Pará. I said, most of the timber is illegal. The federal prosecutor I know them, they have dismantled, over the last 2 years, several huge organized criminal timber networks. With corruption and really very professional criminal organizations. This was all exported to the European Union and other countries. So this is why it's organized forced crime, I call this, because they've got the paperwork right and etc. So one of the things I say, please use insights from criminology, because criminologists know a little bit about illegal activities and what you can do against it. And then there's another sector, people from the forensics, the timber forensics, so people who know about the DNA and the isotopes, what they can do is determine the type of species and the geographical origin. They cannot not immediately say, it's from there, but you have to make a database. But this is all possible. And they say, please use our technology. Because now what's happening with the timber, there's a lot of false declarations. It's from another country. For example, Malaysia already exports for years, it's known, has dubious, where does it all come from? It's impossible that Malaysia produces all the timber. We all know it's from neighboring countries, a lot of from Indonesia. And so, so it's the timber species that wrongly reported, and the geographic origin. So there's a lot of that science can help, and it's not used.
Why is that? Why is it not being used?
In the report for the Global Forest Expert Panel, we had this strong recommendation: use this. Yeah. But and then the UN. The UN spoke with our union about the press conference. They want it, but it's the countries that have to decide and to put some money in it. This is how the UN works too. They said yes, with UN. With the UN, it's forest crime is high on the agenda. But eventually it's these countries that have to fund the project or something. And I know that some of these UN people are sometimes a bit frustrated because they say, this is what you have to do, but eventually countries have to do it. And they're reluctant.
Now, before I go into the audience and I collect a few questions, I have one last question. We are all consumers here. What would you advise us, after listening to both of your presentations, I want to actually better my life. I want to be, a better consumer, a more conscious consumer. I'm a vegetarian. I do eat soy. What can I do? What should I do?
Well, I think soy, there's no problem with that. I don't see a problem with that. It's better to do it to either organic. I'm not sure how good the control system is, but that's already a huge thing. Just if you look at the ecological footprint, with beef is huge. So if you're vegetarian, that already helps a lot. And then there's timber. Well, there's a lot of products you can look at. I mean, also leather. People, you never think about leather, but Brazil is also, I mean, if you're the biggest beef exporter, you're also the biggest leather exporter, and indeed it's exported worldwide. A lot of it is actually illegal. Greenpeace a few years ago published a big report about this. Slaughtering the Amazon, it's called, about cattle. No, maybe tell others. I mean, I know people, spread the message. I mean, people, I generally notice the consciousness is quite low. Yeah. A few months ago I was in Norway, and I noticed that the consciousness is much higher about palm oil. That people, is the palm oil? Oh no, I'm not buying a product with palm oil. I said,
why is that, you think?
Well, because palm oil contributes to deforestation in Malaysia and in Indonesia.
No, I know but why is it that
Well,
Norway
I thought that was interesting. I think I was there last year. There was also a television campaign about rainforest. All the buses had posters about rainforest. I said, that's interesting. I noticed that the consciousness was much higher than in the Netherlands. I thought, that's an interesting case. Could be to examine why is the consumer consciousness in Norway higher than in the Netherlands. And they were shocked about my talk. They said, but we thought we knew about forest, we knew about palm oil, and the Norwegians told me, but we didn't know about the soy. I said, okay. So then something is needed there. I believe, consumer consciousness, we have to learn. I mean, this is...
Polly, where would you advise consumers to begin?
Well, this is really about conscious consumerism. We all have a choice. It's up to us whether or not we choose to buy vegetables sprayed with chemicals and pesticides and grown in agro-industrialized processes, or choose to buy organic. It's a choice at the end of the day. And it comes down to individuals taking that choice, but actually it's interesting because it's a political act. And I say that meaning a small political act, but to buy that which is a harmful activity, that's derived from a harmful activity, you're becoming complicit in keeping it in place. It's rather like knowing that, yes, it's illegal logging, well, hey, we'll build with it. You become complicit within the system. There's a huge sense of disempowerment when you feel you can't do anything, when you have a government that's complicit in it as well. And this is where the role of NGOs is very important, to raise awareness, such as like in Norway. I happen to know that they did an awful lot of campaigning around that. So, it has effect. So we have different actors coming into play here. But ultimately, it may sound terribly fundamental, but it's about responsibility, our ability to respond. And that actually takes a certain amount of courage to turn around and say, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to stand for something better. And that, I don't even think it's about activism. I think it's about something that you mentioned when you asked those individuals whether or not they were activists and said, no, I'm just an earth protector. I think each and every one of us has the potential to be an earth protector, even in the tiniest way, because that creates ripples right across the world.
Thank you for that. Yes, let's clap for that. I am looking at my watch, and we have time for, I would say, 3 questions. And I know that doesn't do justice to the tremendous amount of expertise in this audience and the energy I feel in this audience. Yes, we already have one hand. I'm going to collect 3. So this is question number 1. I will collect them and then put them back to the table.
My question is, as a small non-profit, trying to raise awareness about deforestation around the world, I'm posting constantly on all the social websites. How can I take some of these huge corporations to court and sue the pants off of them? Simple. I've been told here, forget about it, you won't be able to do it. I don't give up.
As an individual?
With my foundation, the Growing Air Foundation, but also as an individual. I'm small, but I'm a pit bull.
Wow. Thank you very much for that question. Very good question. Question number 2 was right here, and I'm going to have to cut through. And no, I'm not going to let go of my microphone, sorry. I'm also a pit bull. Yes. Yes. All right. Sorry to squeeze through. Yes.
My name is Leo van der Vlist. I work for the Netherlands Center for Indigenous Peoples. It's an NGO, so I'm going to raise the awareness here a little bit further about the Netherlands. Last December, our government declared all the Malaysian timber we are buying as sustainable timber even. So we're going one step further than just accepting it as legal timber, we're calling it sustainable. And this week, by coincidence, Friends of the Earth released a report how the rights of indigenous peoples in Malaysia are systemically damaged by the timber industry. So something's definitely wrong. So you should all be at The Hague this Wednesday afternoon because there's a parliamentary debate there at 3 o'clock, and raise your voice. But I have a question too. My question to Polly is, what do you think about initiatives like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the Ruggie Principles on Business and Human Rights? Does it lead anywhere, or what do you think?
Thank you very much. And Wednesday, 3 o'clock, right? Yeah. The Hague, Parliament. Sorry. Very quickly, yes. Sorry. I'm not going to refuse you anything, of course, after your introduction.
Yeah. I mean to take these corporations to court using ecocide as their crime.
Yeah.
Good addition. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Now, question number 3 was right in the front. Yes. Are you with us still for drinks after this event is over? Okay, so you know where to go for your...
Thanks a lot. I'm Femke Weidekop. I work at IUCN Netherlands for defending environmental defenders, and I really appreciated also Tim's contribution about the violence against environmental defenders. I think we can speak of co-violations of nature's rights and the rights of human beings. My question to Tim is, we talk about criminal law. What do you think about the possibility for a binding treaty for transnational corporations to respect human rights? And that could also include tort law. So I'm wondering about the role of tort law and that treaty to protect nature's rights.
Can I ask a stupid question? What is tort law?
Okay. You know the climate case? That was an example of tort law. That is the law between private parties. The state is also a private party sometimes, so that's why they could litigate against the state. If you are a human, you're a person, you go to a company, it's tort law that is valid. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for those subtitles for a non-expert that is clearly a minority tonight. First question, the ecocide lawsuit feasibility question.
Okay,
Polly.
this is kind of like speed legal advice in 1 minute. Suing costs an awful lot of money, takes an awful long time, and ultimately doesn't stop a company. If they do lose, you may get a little bit of something paid out that's too little too late. That's why criminal law is so much more effective, because you're holding individuals to account in a criminal court of law that can actually put people behind bars. But also it allows you to bring in restorative justice provisions, which in fact I'm very interested in, and there's a kind of longer discussion to have there. The short answer is suing is a very long and painful process. Prosecuting is far shorter. You have access to far better ways of accessing evidence as well. But of course, we don't have ecocide law in place yet. So we need to get it in fast. Yeah.
Right. Second question of the gentleman who also directed us to The Hague this Wednesday. Who can I give the floor? Tim, Polly?
Was it to you, was it?
Yeah, forgive me. I never remember
Leo's
3 questions.
question,
What was the question
What do you
again?
think of Ruggie framework?
Oh, Ruggie frameworks, exactly. Okay, so this actually comes back to the hierarchy, the governance hierarchy. Yeah. I mean, all of this is very helpful, but it's not, it's the good guys that sign up to all of this, in truth. Or, in fact, what you do is, interestingly, when I was the honorary Arnie Ness professor up in Oslo 3 years ago, one of the major suppliers of weapons of mass destruction was signed up to the UN Global Compact and was very proud of that. And indeed, their employees were very proud of that. and said that they treated their employees very well, even though they were supplying weapons of mass destruction that were obviously killing hundreds of thousands of lives. So there's a huge problem here when you're dealing with just soft compliance mechanisms. They can act as the greenwash, or they can act as the kind of public face of something that's far harmful, more harmful behind it, and indeed something that's far more harmful that is legal as well. So yes, it gets us some way, but when you're looking at that hierarchy of governance, the next inevitable step is for those who certainly won't comply with those forms of soft mechanisms, then you're looking at compliance through international criminal provisions.
Last question. Am I correct in assuming that that question was actually for Tim? Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, but it is a kind of a legal question, right? About tort law, so no?
The binding treaty.
I think it will certainly help. No, I don't want to be seeing. I work more maybe on the grassroots with communities. So I'm not sure. I mean, yes, it is a good idea, I think, but I'm not. It's not really my specialties. But one of the things that I try to do, maybe just very quickly, a problem of many of these communities. They live there, but they're not officially recognized as such. It's difficult to imagine if you're living in here, but what's happening in the Amazon a lot. Communities are living there, maybe 50, maybe 100, maybe 200 years, and they never thought, they never thought, let's go to the central government, to the federal government, and register. They never did that. They just live there. And because they live there, they have rights to live there. But it should be recognized by the state. But the state, how the state functions, if you want to be recognized as a community, you have to give a map to the government with GPS. Because then only that's how the bureaucracy works. So I've one of these communities, and I said, I paid for the map, or some of them, not me, but a little, some money, and this now they can go to the government and be officially recognized, which helps them to defend their rights. These are sometimes simple things. You just need to make a map, which means you need a GPS camera and somebody doing that, and then you go to a shop and print it and make slides, and then you can go to the government. And then they said, okay, now we can talk. Sometimes that's simple. So that's why I give them tools. To empower them, and I think this helps too. But I'm not qualified enough to comment on it, so that's why.
What really strikes me tonight, in your example with the airfares, and in your example with the GPS cameras, it's also very much about disenfranchisement, and actually about poor and rich, and yeah. I would love to continue talking to both of you and to all of you for that matter, but unfortunately we are running late, and I do really want us to enjoy Lilian for one last time with yet another poem. So can I ask you for another round of applause of Lilian Vieira and Kees Gelderblom.
Onça sem pelo. Não é por conta do medo que eu não encaro de frente a onça sem pelo. Amoitada em mim, não lhe vejo a cara. Só vislumbro no espelho o rastro das patas. Também a surpreendo oblíqua e maquilada em faces conhecidas, onde risos de empréstimo lembram dentes protéticos em bocas caricatas. Bem sei que essa onça enconça e arredia, ora lépida no bote, ora lenta na agonia, faz tranças brancas nas fontes e pergaminho nas peles. Bem sei que essa onça se enjaula na caixa, de ossos mordendo-me de quando em quando os flancos, em discretas ameaças ou lambendo-me as chagas em provisória pena. Mas astuta, cresce a sombra, morcegando-me o sangue de sede insaciável.
Dank u wel. Thank you.
Lilian, Vieira, and Kees Gelderbrom on guitar. Thank you so much. Let's keep clapping because I would like to ask for another warm round of applause for our two very special guests. Thank you so much, Polly Higgins, and not just for being here tonight, but for the wonderful work you do. Thank you, Tim Boekhout from Solinge. Of course, also thanks to Philipp for your wonderful introduction. And after 16 freedom lectures, this was my last freedom lecture that I'm hosting because I'm also at one of those critical crossroads. I'm actually a candidate for the next parliamentary election. So I took note of what you said. But I would like to use this opportunity to thank the lady without whom we actually wouldn't be having a freedom lecture, let alone 16 of them. I know she doesn't like this, but I would like to ask to join me on stage the one and only Meerte of DeBalie, who will be taking the microphone from now on. So symbolically, Meerte, here's the microphone. Thank you so much for our cooperation and good luck with the rest of the Freedom Lecture series. There is a wonderful program coming up. I cannot disclose who is coming yet, but the next Freedom Lectures will be really amazing. So stay tuned, look at the Balie website and buy your tickets in time because they tend to sell out fast. Meerte, thank you so much. Here you go.
The bar is open.
Tim, that was really fabulous.